The Death Star is a structure of such gargantuan scale it is almost impossible to comprehend when you sit down and look at the specific details. The Empire spent 19 years constructing it, only to lose it within a week of it becoming operational. That works out to 990 days of construction for every day of operation. Now, that kind of government efficiency is probably the most realistic thing that has come out of the Star Wars universe. But the question that I want to ask is, what if the Empire had decided to do something else with all of those resources that went into building a planet-killing battle station? What else could they have built? Now, I need to caveat this video with a few disclaimers. Firstly, maths isn't my strongest suit, so numbers here are rough estimates based on loose calculations. I've also had to make some assumptions because there is a lack of fleshed out detail in some circumstances. I'm confident though that my figures are roughly correct, and I'm going to put in my calculations in the description of this video if you want to have a look. So we have the Death Star. It's 120 kilometers in diameter, which actually makes it larger than over half the moons in our own solar system and about 30 times smaller than our own moon. But that is still absolutely massive. It's estimated to have cost over 1.5 trillion Imperial credits and contained 123 hyperdrive generators to power its engines. So for us to see what the Empire could have built instead, we're going to have to break this down into type of resource. And this is where my first assumption is going to come into play. You see, the Death Star's outer shell is made of quadrillion steel 3 kilometers thick. The internals were made of durasteel. We don't have any details for how much quadrillion weighs or what its value is, so I'm just going to keep it simple and just compare it like for like with man-made steel from Earth. With a diameter of 120 kilometers, that roughly gives the Death Star a surface area of 45,238 kilometers. Now, keep in mind that our quadrillion shell is 3 kilometers thick. So this means they would take a quadrillion tons of man-made steel to construct a shell of similar size. To put that into perspective, the entire production of steel on Earth per year is only 1.9 billion tons. So it would take 526,300 years to produce enough steel to create the shell for the Death Star on Earth. Thankfully for the Empire, they had multiple planets and slaves to use for resources, so they got that figure down to just under 2 decades. But what could 1 quadrillion tons of steel build instead? Well, if we take a look firstly at the TIE Fighter, which is the flimsy backbone of the Imperial Navy, they could have had 428 trillion TIE Fighters instead of 1 Death Star. Though they probably would have had a problem recruiting that many pilots to go with them. What about the mighty Imperial class Star Destroyer, my favourite Star Wars ship? Well, for 1 Death Star, you could build 20 trillion Star Destroyers. Again, just for comparison, the Empire had 25,000 Star Destroyers in the galaxy at the height of its power. Darth Vader's armour needs to be replaced regularly. Well, instead of a Death Star, the Dark Lord of the Sith could have had a few spare parts, about 8.3 quadrillion to be precise. He'd never be short for a codpiece again. So enough of the Star Wars comparisons, let's try and put that into the perspective of our world. So one of the most famous landmarks, one of the most famous monuments is the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. It's a mile long, and the resources that went into building the Death Star could have built 11.3 billion bridges instead. That's 11.3 billion miles, which is long enough to take you from here on Earth to beyond the edge of the solar system. Wembley Stadium, iconic for us Brits and the home of football. It can seat 90,000 people at a time, but for 1 quadrillion tons of steel, you could get 43.4 billion Wembleys, enough to seat 3.9 quadrillion people, which is about 35,500 times more people that have ever lived in the entirety of history. Cybertrucks. I get the feeling that the Empire would love a Cybertruck. They could have had 333 trillion Cybertrucks with the amount of steel used in the Death Star. Now, that's just from the 3-kilometer shell. All of these figures are just from that 3-kilometer thick shell. We haven't even looked at the internal durasteel structure, which housed most of the machinery for the power core and the superweapon. Speaking of, according to StarWars.com, the super laser used 8 giant Kyber crystals to create the planet-destroying beam. Now, assumption number 2 here is that the Kyber crystals they're talking about are the same size as the one that we saw in Rebels, but without more detailed information, it's really hard to say. Now, if those were the ones that we used, we can estimate that roughly it's about 7 meters long and 1.5 meters in diameter. Now, the average Kyber crystal is about 1.5 inches long and about 1/2 inch in diameter, the ones that go into the lightsabers. Now, if my math adds up, then for each giant crystal, you could have powered 754,000 lightsabers. Add in those 7 other Kyber crystals, and that's the equivalent of 6 million lightsaber crystals that are powering the Death Star's laser. Lastly, let's take a look at money, something that I think we can all comprehend a bit easier than materials and crystals. So we don't really have any idea what the conversion rate is for 1 Imperial credit to US dollar, so we're just going to keep this comparison in universe for now. Earlier I mentioned the figure of 1.5 trillion Imperial credits. I kind of think that's quite a conservative figure. I think that the actual cost would have been far more, but just for the sake of this video, we're going to keep to that figure just for now. So with 1.5 trillion credits, here's just a few things that you could buy. 1.5 billion heavy blasters. 18,750 quarterly Imperial sector payrolls. 750 million second-hand Skywalker land speeders. 88.2 million trips with Han Solo to Alderaan, or 300 billion doses of death sticks. That is a lot, and this list doesn't even cover the manpower and the resources that were poured into the research and development of the Death Star itself. It's absolutely mind-boggling when you sit down and think about the numbers. And it's even more astounding when you consider the fact that they built a second, even bigger Death Star. Now, this was a fun video to make. It was a lot of research, a lot of numbers, a lot of calculations, and a lot of hard work, but I hope that you have enjoyed it. If you want to check out some of those calculations, I'm going to list them in the description of the video. By all means, feel free to ask me any question about them in the comments below. If you have enjoyed it, then please do consider subscribing so that you don't miss out on more fun Star Wars content.